My dear Pure History students, congratulations! You've made it to your final unit, which is Unit 4. So, Unit 4 is about decolonization and the emergence of nation states. We are going to be looking specifically at Malaya for this lesson. Do take note that this is part 1 of 2 parts. Your second part will come in your next lesson. Are you ready to begin? Before we begin looking at the content, let's first unpack these very huge bombastic words that we see here. First and foremost, what is decolonization? Decolonization is the undoing of colonization, and very often when a country experiences decolonization, it tends to be followed up with independence as well. Second definition that we need to know is what is a nation state. A nation shares a national identity. They have physical borders as well as a single government. The whole idea of a nation state is relatively new. It was only in about the 1900s that we have nations popping up all over the world. In the past, at least, what you used to have is a lot of empires or people who live based on, say, their village chiefs' rules. Okay, there was no idea of a Singaporean, for example. In the previous lesson, what I got you to do was to read the introduction chapter, chapter 1, and in chapter 1, you would have seen these 3 reasons being mentioned about quite briefly as reasons for decolonization in Southeast Asia. It will be very helpful for you if you have a good understanding of these 3 reasons, because moving forward, at least in this chapter, you will see these reasons popping up very often. So let's do a quick recap on Sec 3. Okay, what do we know about British Malaya? We know that British Malaya comprises of the Strait Settlements, the ones in red, as well as the Federated Malay States. Okay, and to some extent, the unfederated Malay States as well. Why did the British colonize Malaya? Mostly because they wanted their tin and rubber, okay, the rich resources. Over there, they introduced the residential system. A plural society was developed where you have multiple races being present in Malaya. There was general unhappiness towards British, but there was no violent struggle. Okay, especially in the early 1800s, there was no idea of independence for Malaya or anything like that. Okay, by and large, they were just workers. They owed their allegiance back to their homeland. So in the 1930s, we start to see some form of political development starting with Kesatuan Melayu Muda, KMM. It's led by a Malay, and basically what he is trying to achieve, okay, this is Ibrahim Yaakob, if I'm not wrong. So what he is trying to achieve is he tries to fight for independence of Malaya. But the problem here is people still don't really care about independence so much, and he is not able to garner the kind of support that he needs. And then we have the Chinese in Malaya who are supporting the Chinese back home, fighting against the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War, as well as the Indians in Malaya who are supporting the freedom fighters back home in India. So if you notice, the races are becoming more politically aware about what they want, but there is no common goal towards independence for Malaya, and there's a general lack of unity. Okay, all the races are just focusing at their own race. There is no common identity of being a Malayan. If that's the case, right, in 1930s, just 30 years ago, people didn't really care much about independence of Malaya. Then my question to you is, why is it that within 27 years, okay, plus minus, in 1957, Malaya was able to achieve independence, and officially at this stage in 1957, they were called the Malayan Federation? What is it that happened? Why is it that people who were so apathetic towards the political affairs of the country suddenly started demanding for independence from the British? So this is our focus of this entire lesson here, to understand the reasons for decolonization as well as the reasons for locals pushing towards independence. Just remember, okay, Malaya is not equals to Malaysia. If you see this picture over here, the Federation of Malaya is a part of the Federation of Malaysia that will be formed later in 1963. Okay, I hope you remember this because you learned about it in Sec 2 when we studied merger. Okay, I hope you do. Our job as a historian is to be able to explain the reasons for decolonization in Malaya. In this lesson at least, I'm going to break this down to make it a little bit simpler for ourselves. We are going to be looking specifically at the role of the impact of World War II and the Japanese occupation in changing the attitude people had towards independence. Okay, remember 1930s people didn't really care, but somehow or another by 1957 they achieved independence. So we are going to look at what was the role of the Japanese occupation as well as the impact of World War II. So let's start. Okay, when we talk about the Japanese occupation of Malaya, we are starting from sometime around December 1941 and it will last until 1945. Very often, historians say that the Japanese occupation is what we call a watershed, otherwise known as a turning point in countries moving towards independence. So a lot of historians will argue that if the Japanese occupation didn't happen, then chances are countries wouldn't have fought for independence as strongly. One of the impacts of World War II and the Japanese occupation was that it shattered the myth of Western superiority. So there was always this idea that the British were somehow superior to the locals. But as you know, when the Japanese defeated a lot of the Western powers, a lot of countries in Asia started feeling that they too could achieve it. Okay, simply by looking at this picture on the left, you notice that they attacked on 8 December 1941 and by 31st Jan 1942, they already had control over Johor Bahru. So the entire British Malaya fell within 7 weeks. And this is a huge achievement for the Japanese. And it's also an avid reminder of the defeat of British in Malaya due to their own weaknesses and their failures. Okay, the British planes were outdated, old, their planning in general was terrible. Okay, they were not prepared, they were very, very focused on the war in Europe. So how exactly does this affect the people? Many of them, when the British decided to come back, they felt a sense of betrayal and they also lost their trust for the British because these people were supposed to protect them, right? However, when the war occurred, they realized that the locals or the people in Malaya were not their first priority. So in general, when the British came back to rule Malaya, okay, people were not so happy about it. The next thing that the Japanese occupation did was to really widen the rift between ethnic groups. So when I say widen the rift between ethnic groups, I'm talking about the Malays and Indians versus the Chinese. So I'm giving you a hint over here. Okay, what happened in Singapore in the between 1942 and 1945 that greatly affected and killed a lot of Chinese? Okay, can you guess from the picture? Okay, it's called the Sukching massacre. So, unlike the Malays and the Indians who were being treated fairly well or fairly respectfully, the Chinese were treated very, very poorly due to the war that Japan was facing together with China. Okay, as a result of the cruel treatment towards the Chinese, we had the rise of groups such as the Malayan Communist Party, who will later regroup themselves and call themselves the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. And this group of people will try to fight for the independence of Malaya from the Japanese. So what we have here is an increased desire towards independence. You have the formation of groups now that are willing to fight against a colonial power, which in this case was the Japanese. And another impact then is the encouragement of the development of nationalist groups that were given by the Japanese. Although in the initial stage, the Japanese really controlled the locals in Asia, they didn't really give them any autonomy per se. By the 1943, because the Japanese was losing a lot of battles all over the world, they felt this need to give in a bit to the people. So they tried to win the hearts of the people by encouraging them to develop their own nationalist groups to fight against the European colonial powers in this case. So one common idea that was going around at this time was the concept of a greater Indonesia, where basically they joined all the countries in red and they wanted to make them one strong country. So the Japanese actually encouraged groups such as the Chris, and they also fought for they wanted to fight for the independence of Malaya and a union with Indonesia. So there was support given by the Japanese, whether it's training in terms of military or whether it's connections with other groups. Okay, and because of this, again, there's an increased desire for independence. So what about the British then, right? these things have happened. Japanese occupation ends in 1945, and we have the British, who was quite badly affected during the war as well, returning to their position in Malaya. Okay, but what did they just go through? Number one, okay, these three flags that you see all represent different countries, and they were all going through decolonization themselves. India was given away. Okay, they could no longer bear the resistance that was going on because of the freedom fighters in India. Okay, you were also had Burma that was given away, and you also had Sri Lanka that were given away. How come if they are giving away all these rich countries in terms of resources, why is it they didn't give away Malaya? Okay, because Malaya, still relatively in terms of resistance, is quite mild. In addition to that, Malaya, because of resources such as tin and rubber, it was really a very profitable area for the British to keep. Okay, this money that they get from British Malaya will help them back home in terms of their recuperation of the industries and the economy that were severely destroyed due to World War II. So when the British came back, as I mentioned earlier, okay, you had people feeling a lot of diverse emotions, but a lot of them felt very betrayed and very angry by the British coming back. In order to appease the people, the British military administration, which was in charge of British Malaya, they decided to make some constitutional changes. So a constitutional change is basically a change to the laws that govern the country, and what they introduced was called the Malayan Union Scheme in 1946. Under this scheme, they will introduce centralized government led by the British Governor General. Sultans will henceforth only have authority over religious matters, and all non-Malays would be offered citizenship as long as they were born or resided in the Malayan Union/Singapore. Okay, so pause for a while, think. Who would be against the Malayan Union scheme? If you mention Sultan, yes, they have clearly lost their rights over a lot of political matters and they are being relegated to only religious matters. But not just the Sultans, also the Malays, because their position would be threatened, right? The Malays believe that they are the indigenous/native people of the land, and therefore they should have privileges/slash special advantages. Okay, however, this time round under the Malayan Union scheme, even non-Malays are being offered citizenship, and this threatens the position of the Malays in society with respect to all the other races. As a result of the Malayan Union scheme, you will have very, very loud opposition because the Malays felt that their position was threatened, and therefore they grouped together. 41 different Malay associations grouped together to form the United Malays National Organization, and they led the movement called Peninsula Malaya Movement in 1946. Okay, the key idea here is that it's the beginning of a united front. Okay, in the past, the Malay associations, they didn't really come together because they had different interests, right? But this time round, it was very, very clear with 41 different Malay associations coming together to protest against the British Malayan Union scheme. And you can really see the seed of independence, or rather the seed of desire for independence growing from here. As a result of the great protests against the Malayan Union scheme, the British had to replace the scheme with a proposal for a Federation of Malaya. So these are the main terms in the proposal. Number one, okay, they will restore governing powers to the sultans, but they have to act in accordance with the advice of the British. So the British are still in power, but you can see them giving a little bit more to the locals in Malaya as compared to previously when they were almost fully in power. The British will still have complete control over defense and foreign affairs. The Malays were recognized as indigenous people, i.e. native people. They will have special position, privileges, and they will have automatic citizenship. However, for the non-Malays, there will be more stringent qualifications for citizenship application. What that basically means is it's not going to be easy for them to get citizenship. And they also promised elections. However, they didn't really say when that would take place. So from the proposal of a Federation of Malaya, you can tell that they are trying to appease the Malays, especially as a group amongst the locals in Malaya. So another opposition arises. Okay, if earlier on we had the Peninsula Malaya movement. Okay, now we have opposition against the Federation of Malaya, led by AMCJA, which basically stands for All Malaya Council of Joint Action, which includes the Malayan Indian Congress and also has groups affiliated to Malayan Communist Party. And later on, they will also be joined by Putra, which is basically a center for people's power. Okay, this is an overload of acronyms, but I'm going to simplify it for you. Okay, these three different groups, the most important thing you need to know is that they are basically comprising of multiple races. The AMCJA was led by the Chinese, the MIC is an Indian group, and the Putra is a Malay group. At this stage, you might wonder, why did the Malays take part in this? Shouldn't they be happy about the proposal for the Federation of Malaya? This particular group under Putra, they were not happy because they felt that the proposal was too much of a compromise with the British. They wanted more power for the Malays. Therefore, these three different groups will join hands together to fight against the proposal for the Federation of Malaya. There will be a total of 140,000 strikers. And if you really think about it, the significance of this event is that there is inter-communal cooperation. And this is something that we haven't seen before. In the 1930s, if you recall, majority of them were just fighting for their own homeland. But by the 1940s, okay, we see the races coming together, putting aside their differences and fighting for a shared goal / common goal. So we see a development of a nation state in its beginning stages. Okay, nonetheless, despite the opposition, they were not successful. And in 1948, we officially have the Federation of Malaya. At this stage, let's come back to our main objective, which is to explain the reasons for decolonisation in Malaya. So what we have really done is to look at the impact of World War II and the jail in showing how there was a shift in attitude of the locals towards independence. Okay. More specifically, if I were to summarize this whole lesson, the real impact of World War II and the Japanese occupation is that it increased the desire for independence from the British. The British were forced to make compromises, and it really paved the way for the formation of nationalist groups. So 1948, Federation of Malaya is achieved. However, I want you to bear in mind that our end goal is Malayan independence in 1957. So in the next lesson, we'll study what has happened between 1948 and 1957. Okay, that's all for this lesson.